So, that's not right. Let's get our screen unscrewed up here. Man, I must be rusty after Thanksgiving, all that tryptophan. There we go. That's about right. Okie doke. So, we left off talking last time a little bit about kind of the second half of the 19th century, that is the 1800s, and how kind of this John Muir guy who's going to end up founding and leading the Sierra Club, you may have heard of that, as a major national organization. John James Audubon in the 1800s is doing a whole bunch of bird painting and illustration to help people understand, wow, this new United States has absolutely crazy and beautiful and interesting and worth seeking out natural resources, including wildlife species, not just the ones that are showing up on our plate commonly or at that time in the 1800s and before, showing up in like women's fashion, like in hats and stuff like that. Exotic songbirds, tropical songbirds in particular, being imported for the fashion industry, or their feathers specifically, to the point that some of those are now extinct. This is kind of the season of, okay, we've got industrial resource extraction power, but it still kind of feels like our resources are infinite. And John Muir and Gifford Pinchot are coming up on the scene in the very end of the 1800s when we're starting to have to face the facts of, wow, our resources are not infinite. And so John Muir has kind of the effort spearheaded across the country before the internet, before radio and stuff like that. He was getting folks to understand, hey, we need to not industrialize and industrially extract every square inch of the surface of the United States. We need to set aside some of it in preservation with a capital P. So, Gifford Pinchot versus John Muir. If you've heard about these guys in any of your other classes, the sense of the struggle between these two, essentially titanic forces in forestry around the year 1900, was the sense that these two guys are two different faces of the same coin. It's the two different facets of answers to the question, how are we going to live as Americans relative to what feels like pretty infinite resources, but in actuality, given our capacity to extract those and harness them and harvest them, not at all infinite. So, when we're using the term preservation in this and related classes, we're talking about trying to manage at least parts of our planetary ecosystem, our planetary life support system, by leaving it alone. That is, if it's got millions of years or thousands of years of evolution, depending on your theology, it's a pretty well-tuned system, and it's a dynamic equilibrium across that time, but for the most part, it's pretty well worked out ways to keep us and everything else alive on its own, right? It's a complex and emergent system with lots of dynamic equilibria happening all at once. Preservation says that seems like it's working pretty well for people who were strongly religious in the Christian tradition at that time, or in any of the three major Abrahamic religions in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. There was a sense that, maybe God created the earth, and if he created it a certain way, then it's probably pretty good to keep at least some of it working like that. So that's this preservation mindset. We can't do better than what nature or God is sort of setting things up to run as. Now, conservation, on the other hand, is a more humanistic mindset and philosophy, or even land use ethic. So an ethic is a system of rules or criteria to help you determine what is good and bad, right and wrong. So the land use ethic helps you answer questions of what's a moral way to use the property of the United States, the property of the American people, versus an immoral or even illegal way. So we're going to get this idea of a land ethic developed kind of in the first half of the 20th century with guys like Aldo Leopold, A. Starker Leopold, Rachel Carson we'll talk about, and stuff like that. And preservation and conservation are two different, basically, flavors of a land use ethic. So, Gifford Pinchot, who's going to essentially lead the head and the foundation of the United States, or what will become the United States Forest Service, in the first decade of the 20th century, he and John Muir disagree pretty hard on some things. Gifford Pinchot, when it comes to this place, Hetchy Valley, which is a steep-walled, glacially sculpted valley in what is now Yosemite National Park. There's this catastrophic fire in San Francisco. And San Francisco at that time is all built out of wood. It's near the San Andreas Fault Zone, and brick structures don't do real well in earthquake zones. It's a very brittle kind of construction, so when you shake it around a little bit, just brick buildings are trying to die. It's a good thing we don't have any brick buildings on campus because we're right next to the Quaternary Fault Zone, which has absolutely catastrophic earthquakes about once every 100 years, and we're just out past 100 years. I'm sure we're fine. Thank you.
And what's that interesting pattern on the walls?
Right. So we've got top people working on it. Top people. Anyway, so San Francisco is a bunch of stick-built wooden structures, like the whole city, and it's a big and rapidly growing city right on the water. It burns to the ground, like most of the city. And this kind of caught people unawares. It's like, this is right on the Pacific Ocean. San Francisco is a pretty cold place. The Bay Area that San Francisco now sprawls all across, it's kind of cold and foggy, and it feels kind of wet most of the year. It's like, how did this place burn down? Well, as it turns out, water weighs over a ton per cubic yard or cubic meter, and it's hard to get water to fight fires quickly when you have to haul it up the very steep hills of most of San Francisco. So, a lot of people were all of a sudden out of a house, and I'm sure we had like those ribbon tying campaigns of like, San Francisco, great fire, never again, never forget, and it's like, yeah, we gotta do something about this. We gotta have houses for these people, and wood-built structures are quicker to sort of resurrect than brick. So what do? Gifford Pinchot's solution was to dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is across the state. If we have the state of California, not to scale, and San Francisco here, Yosemite is about here. So his idea was Yosemite is high elevation. It's tied to the Sierra Nevadas mountain system. It's not just a beard. And water likes to flow downhill. Win-win-win, right? So there's a whole bunch of snow melt. If we capture some of that snow melt, just kind of bank it for the city of San Francisco and LA, so we can have our fish tacos in LA and so forth. We can just flow that water downhill to San Francisco and the Imperial Valley, which is going to be a huge thing, so we can have our avocados in January here in the United States. And like, what, 40-50% of all of our produce is grown here, fresh goods. So that solves the problem, right? It fixes the glitch, as they say in the movie Office Space. John Muir says, wait a minute. You can't just, like, take a place like Hetch Hetchy Valley. This place is so beautiful, it's literally considered sacred by Native Americans who lived and who still live around there. And oh yeah, it's also part of one of our, national parks. This is like the one place where we shouldn't be just borrowing resources for faraway folks who don't really care about it in San Francisco and in the Imperial Valley downslope and so on and so forth. So John Muir is a pretty impassioned guy, and he's not just being obstructionist for the sake of like getting in the way of progress and development and stuff like that. Like, this is the era in the early 1900s of like rapid progress and development and technological innovation and rapid population growth, if nothing else. So he's actually an immigrant. He works on and manages the massive farm of his wife's father. Imagine if you had in-law problems and your in-law was also your boss. He liked to get away from that scene a little bit. He was kind of a workaholic and an inventor, and used to go up into the Sierras, like near where Yosemite is now, and just go up in the mountains and be kind of a wild guy. Like, there are a bunch of stories of him taking one of those like folded up handkerchiefs and throwing a bunch of hardtack in there, basically flour baked into a brick, and some loose tea and his tea mug and a little kettle and stuff like that, and just like disappearing into the Sierras for a week, just to take some time off, blow off some steam. You know, the mountains are calling and I must go, that kind of a vibe. Like, he actually said stuff like that. Like, he's the originator of a lot of those quotes that we now put on our bumper stickers and vinyl on our laptops. Mountains are calling and I must go. So, in one of these trips to the Yosemite area, he is reported as climbing up into a tree during a lightning storm in the Sierras to be closer to the action. Like, that's kind of, you know, like if John Muir had knuckle tattoos, it would say no brakes, you know, like there's no brakes on this hype train. I'm not sure he would say it like that, but anyway, he's also a deeply religious person, as it turns out, and considered his work to protect places like Hetch Hetchy Valley from the conservation efforts of people like Gifford Pinchot, who wanted to dam the valley, turn our forests into steady, regular supplies, sustainable supplies of timber for making houses and toilet paper and so forth. John Muir's position is, hey everybody, this valley that some of these other guys and gals want to dam up so we can have a little bit more convenient drinking water in places like San Francisco, hundreds of miles away. This place is more sacred than any cathedral built by the hands of men. We cannot build buildings that are like Hetch Hetchy Valley. We can't even try, and it's kind of a joke when we do. So it would be not just kind of a bad solution to a normal problem. To dam Hetch Hetchy Valley, it might actually be like constructively evil, because we're destroying one of the most beautiful and unique places in God's creation. And yeah, we can do this. We can. And that doesn't mean we should. So let's preserve some places. Let's set aside some areas. Remember, at this time, there is no Forest Service. There is no National Park Service either. And so these questions are an open debate. It's not like, well, we have a whole bunch of precedent to go back on. We're figuring this out as we go. We're laying the track as we're rolling the train out along it. Okay. So these two guys happen to get into the Oval Office with a president, Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, super outdoorsy and so forth. And Roosevelt kind of played both sides. He was like, okay, yeah, I see the need for forest reserves, timber preserves that are basically not preserved. They are used for the utilitarian value that is the greatest good for the most people for the longest period of time. So the utilitarian ethic is, what's like, if we're going to use these resources, what's like the most optimized way to do that? How can we benefit the most people? How can we make it sort of steady state, long-term, sustainable? That's the utilitarian approach. And that makes sense for you and me thinking about working with the Forest Service, right? So, Roosevelt and some others around that time, and Gifford Pinchot, who had been trained in the European style of silvicultural forestry, because Europe has been farmed and logged and so forth and settled by Western culture for the last couple thousand years. So there's not a whole lot of wildlands anywhere in Europe, and that was Gifford Pinchot's sense of things coming out of the Yale School of Forestry. Whenever you talk to somebody out of the Yale School of Forestry, they always say Yale School of Forestry, like they land on it real hard and kind of look around like, you know, I went to Yale, right?
Yeah.
So Gifford Pinchot, a stand-up guy. I'm poking fun at my colleagues at Yale, but their School of Forestry is a long-running and well-respected thing. I don't think it's as big as ours, but anyway. So we have this utilitarian mindset. And Roosevelt ultimately sides with Gifford Pinchot. He says, well, this might be a beautiful sacred place. And John Muir, I hear you when you say we need places to play in and to pray in. Because if Hetch Hetchy is more powerful, more sacred than any cathedral could be, if what is now Muir Woods, named for John Muir, is a more sacred cathedral with a whole bunch of really big tree organisms in it, then okay, yeah, we'll set aside some of these places as national parks. We'll set aside some of these other places as forests, but we need to solve a practical problem for San Francisco and the Imperial Valley and the rich farmers there right now. So, John Muir actually died shortly after the decision to dam Hetch Hetchy Valley. He died brokenhearted. He literally poured his life and his health into this national letter writing campaign, started the Sierra Club to try and help people agitate with him and write their senators, write the president, stuff like that. And the decision came down and he fell ill and died shortly after that. But he ended up, sort of environmental historians kind of point out that he ended up kind of winning the war. So in direct response to the understandable, but in for many people, unpopular decision to turn a beautiful place into a utilitarian water storage lake with a very sort of plain-looking dam. There was this groundswell of support in the immediate time following John Muir passing away, and one direct effect was the creation of the United States National Park Service about 10 years later in 1916. So, in that first decade of the 20th century, Roosevelt is laying the groundwork for the creation of federal agencies that can handle both ends of this spectrum of how we treat our land, how we value it, how we value human life and need to satisfy human needs and so forth. And a lot of stuff starts speeding up from this point. Okay, so in 1906 we get stuff like the Antiquities Act, and at this time we have, now that the Civil War is over, a real desire to start competing with and overtaking Europe in terms of being like the tourism destination. Like there are a lot of pretty wealthy cities in Europe, and a lot of folks who've been going to the Alps for a long time. But relative to all of Europe, and relative to the size of American states, there was this conversation at that time of, anything you can do, we can do better. And it's like, all right, let's have a whole bunch of rich Europeans show up, leave all their money with us on their trip, and then go away. And that seems like it's a pretty cool thing. So there was this conversation back and forth between, European society and American Western societies of, okay, so, Europeans are kind of looking down their noses at Americans culturally because we don't have 1,000 years of castle building. We can't go to American castles except for a few very sort of nouveau riche, new money kinds of monuments to specific rich individuals, like the Vanderbilt estate. If you've ever been there in North Carolina, it's a beautiful, beautiful wood mansion. But we do have stuff like Niagara Falls and Horseshoe Falls, and there's nothing really of that scale anywhere in all of Europe across all of those countries. We're one country, and with one middle finger, we can signal how much we think of their total lack of Niagara Falls. So, there's this effort, this kind of broad scale across a bunch of states and federally effort to sort of position America as, like, this is where you want to go if you want to, like, actually enjoy your trip. Like, you could go circumnavigate the Alps and, like, hike from hut to hut and have your mulled wine and stuff like that. If you want to be boring, that's fine, no judgment. Just, we've got Niagara Falls, and we've got the Rocky Mountains, and we've got the Sierras, we got Yosemite. I mean, we've got giant sequoia and coastal redwoods. You guys have big trees. Oh, you don't have any big trees. Yeah. I love that for us, not for you. You know, just this sort of passive-aggressive snipping back and forth to kind of come out ahead as where do people go when they have some time and money? And so Niagara Falls, which is currently a state park, started accepting a whole bunch of this tourism because folks would come over on like a steamer, a packet ship, clipper ship from Europe, and then just go, land in New York City at the Deepwater Harbor there, and then go across the state to Niagara Falls. The problem is, in the 1800s, there's no National Park Service. There's not really even a functional state park system. It's just a bunch of like upstate New York to get across. And so you hire the 1870s equivalent of Uber, literally a horse-drawn carriage over a dirt road, and you like ride in a bumpy carriage for a couple of days, because New York is actually a pretty wide state, as it turns out, especially at horse speeds. And for those couple of days, your taxi driver, your carriage driver, has kind of a captive audience. So it's a long, bumpy ride. And so these cabbies would basically, be like, oh man, I think the horse is getting a lame foot. Geez, we're slowing down in the middle of nowhere. I wonder if there are any, at that time they would say Indians. Man, I bet if we just had some extra cash, we could, they're kind of like shaking down their passengers. What are European passengers doing? They barely speak English, right? And they just make up all of these stories to just kind of fill all the dead time for a couple of days. Like, imagine your server at a restaurant talking at you for a couple of days to try and like keep things. It started wearing on people, and people were by 1900 pointing out and realizing legitimately that if you just sort of leave tourism companies and operators like this to their own devices, it's a mess. They're gonna say anything. They're gonna do anything. Back at that time, there were a bunch of buildings built like right out to the edge, and even a few cantilevered over the edges of the falls, and like every once in a while one of these buildings like falls in, and it's like people get mad when they die, and like it's a huge tourist trap. Like, if you've ever been to Gatlinburg, anybody? Okay, Gatlinburg is a lot. If you don't know to expect like a whole bunch of matched airbrush shirts and like katana shops and stuff like that, like, why not in Gatlinburg? Why not? Think of that, but like way bigger, because this is like the primary spot for European tourists to come and show up. So around this time, we've got the positive example of Yosemite and Yellowstone and a couple of other places created by the time of the death of John Muir that are absolutely shining star examples of the natural resources that a park could be used to protect. And because they're designated by Congress, they're not super overgrown with a bunch of like natty tourist stuff, just like tchotchke shops and that sort of thing that just are like, just kind of like the 1890s version of glitter. Like once it gets into an area, it's everywhere and it looks kind of trashy. It's no good. Anyway, glitter is like the visual herpes of our day. Anyway, so we have this as a negative example. We have some national parks, but not really managed by anybody, as positive potential examples. So it's around this time, like 1905, 1906 to 1916, that we get organizations like the Forest Service, the Park Service, started up by Congress. Now, it's kind of a soup sandwich because Congress, again, is still just feeling out what this should look like. So for the 2-year, 8-year term, or for the 2-term, 8-year tenure of Teddy Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt president, we get set aside 100 million acres of forest reserves. They're not national forests yet. We don't have a Forest Service yet. But soon, and for the rest of our lives, we will. 4 years later, halfway through his time, the Transfer Act transfers those forest reserves into not the United States Forest Service, but its precursor, the Bureau of Forestry, right? Congress is still legit having to invent stuff like the Department of Agriculture, which is going to house the Forest Service and other conservation-minded organizations or appendages of the federal government. we're also having to step back and realize, okay, so if we give everything to the Forest Service, they're going to tend to run everything one way. And our national parks don't really feel like they fit that mold. We're not trying to produce board feet of timber. We're not trying to manage park watersheds for clean drinking water for cities. We're just managing them as beautiful lakes, pristine lakes, fishing lakes, instead of just water supply, okay? In 1906, 2/3 of the way through Roosevelt's total 8 years, we get the Antiquities Act, and this is such a humble brag flex on the part of the president. So we have this traditional balance of powers in the United States federal government, right? Like the judicial interprets the law, executive branch enacts the law, and Congress writes the law, and so forth. Well, in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt, because he's a pretty go-getter kind of a guy, managed to get out of Congress concessions of the Antiquities Act. So instead of having to run an idea for a national park or national forest, something like that, through Congress, he can just take out a sheet of paper and, as the president, write an executive order to create a national monument. The whole thing can take about 10 minutes versus maybe 10 years and multiple different Congresses to walk the idea of a national park through as a national park. So once it gets thrown into the national park system, it can't go away. That is a permanent federal designation. So Congress wants to be real sure that if we set aside something in the national park, we have to answer questions like at Arches National Park, where there's a huge amount of strategic uranium ore, which is important for national security interests and so forth, and defense. If we turn Arches National Park into a park, we're saying that from now until forever, the heat death of the universe or the collapse of the United States, whichever comes first, we can't do anything on the map polygon of Arches National Park, including mine fissile uranium material out of the uranium hexafluoride, the yellow pig ore sitting under the Chinle Formation in those rocks. We're just going to use it as a park, period. And it doesn't matter if that constitutes a national security threat. We are doing this as a park because we can't preserve it and mine it out. We can't have our cake and eat it as well. Preservation doesn't allow for that, right? We can't optimize beyond what nature or God already has. So, this Antiquities Act is a big deal. And we still see stuff like this going back and forth between Congress and the president and things like mining interests to this day. In the previous presidential administration, 2 national monuments right outside of the Grand Canyon National Park were threatened with delisting so that they could be mined. So Bears Ears National Monument and another went under consideration as we're going to stop using these as national monuments and see if we can open them up to essentially powerful mining interests to make a ton of money for those companies. And some other folks were like, well, no, that's not so great. Let's not do that, because once we start the mining, we can't like put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's a permanent change for a short-term industrial and economic benefit. Yes?
Who has the power to delist national monuments like that?
The president.
President?
Yeah. Or the executive branch under him, yeah.
So national monuments technically aren't permanent designations.
That is correct.
Okay.
Our parks.
Because I was curious as like why Gateway Arch got classified as a national park rather than a national monument.
Yeah, so let's talk about this process for a sec, because this has real impacts on you and me in terms of stuff like wilderness formation is much the same way, although that legislation came 50 years later. We'll get to that. So we have land, and then somebody gets the good idea or bad idea to set it aside. Say, this area, like, it'd be fine for mining and stuff like that. Some people could get rich off of that. First director of the United States National Park Service funded the National Park Service personally because Congress didn't give it a budget. A guy named Stephen Tying Mather. It was a borax mining baron. So Laundry Booster funded the national parks. I find that fantastic because my laundry gets disgusting when I go to national parks. Anyway, moving on. Somebody identifies a parcel of land that is not in some other kind of use. It could or it could not be in private hands. If it is in private hands, there's an extra step that might have to come into play called eminent domain. Essentially, the power, benefit, authority of all of the people of the United States, because we have a representative republic democracy, we can, through our agents in Congress, decide that, you know what, for the benefit of all, we're going to take this farmer's land and turn it into maybe a national park someday. But Congress is slow and ineffective and weak. And anyway, so typically what the president does, whatever president is sitting at that time, designates a national monument and designates which agency is going to take care of it. Just kind of be custodian of that space while we figure out what to kind of permanently do with that chunk of land. So, for example, Fish and Wildlife is going to manage something like Bears Ears National Monument a little bit differently than the Forest Service would, and a little bit differently than the Park Service would, even though Fish and Wildlife and the United States National Park Service are in the same branch of the executive government called the Department of Interior. So we've got Department of Agriculture, USDA, and Department of Interior. And then like a dozen different federal agencies, maybe more now, that do various kinds of land management. Also including the Department of Defense, the Army Corps of Engineers, which manages the bases and the artillery ranges and the practice ranges of our military. Okay? So, once we get something sort of designated as a national monument overnight, somebody gets the ear of the president's like, yeah, sure, you donated a bunch to me. No, I'm kidding. That's a very cynical take on things, but that's totally how it happens. Anyway, maybe after some time, in some cases decades of time, Congress circles around back to that spot and says, okay, yeah, this national monument, like we've been just kind of sitting on it for a while and, you know, a few people visit it and stuff like that, but there's really a good story here to tell. And this is worth preserving. So it goes to become a national park through an act of Congress, right? They basically write a law saying you are now such and such national park. Or they'll say, okay, this is, doesn't really meet the litmus test for a national park, but we could get some really good land management value out of this. Let's turn it into a national grassland from being the national monument that it is. And now the Forest Service, because grasslands serve a conservation mandate instead of national parks for range and grazing and stuff like that, and research. It becomes that and goes under Forest Service, which is under United States Department of Agriculture management. And they apply all their conservation-oriented tools to managing that land, all their expertise. Okay? So, all that to say, in the early 1900s, we're like literally writing the laws to figure out how to do this stuff the first time. And as everybody knows with your school assignments, not that you have very many school assignments in this class, your first draft of something is kind of a trash fire, right? Your first attempt at setting up a National Park Service, kind of a trash fire in that case. So Congress was like, okay, yeah, let's make a National Park Service. And no, to back up one step, this guy, Stephen Tyng Mather, the borax magnate, like, if you wanted Laundry Booster, he's your guy. Mining stuff mostly in the southwestern United States, where dry salt or evaporite minerals like gypsum and borax are plentiful and cheap to mine. They're near the surface. He goes with some of his newfound money before we have a National Park Service, so like first couple years of the 1900s, with his wife to some of these national parks because he is rich. And doesn't he deserve? Give it to me, I'm worth it, as the song goes. and he was not impressed because nobody's really managing these national parks with expertise. Now remember, we got the United States Cavalry managing some of the parks. We have like this loose sort of ad hoc coalition of like locals and state wildlife officials and like occasional federal agents. Like you remember Harry Yount from before Thanksgiving, the one guy who had the horrible job of running Yellowstone in 1872, 1873, that winter. We all remember how well that went. So it's basically the next 40 years of that, right? Up to 1912. And so Stephen Tangmather, a rich guy and a real sort of like go-getter, like one of those dudes who wakes up naturally at 4:30 in the morning and is just like irritatingly productive. Yeah, one of those guys. So he writes a letter to Congress. I mean, just imagine the sand you'd have to write an angry letter to Congress saying, the way that you are, I'm paraphrasing here, but the way that you guys are handling our national parks is a disgrace. This is a mess. It's chaos. This is like a trash fire of a national effort, and you are bad and you should feel bad. Again, paraphrasing. They used longer words in 1910. So Congress writes him a letter back. And Congress says, this is so America in the early 1900s. Think you can do better? Okay, do better. So, in 1916, Stephen Tangmather says, so okay, well maybe I will. And Congress is like, okay, then fine. And they're like, we'll write as a part of the 1916 Organic Act, basically like just like a roll together thing of a whole bunch of just administrative stuff that Congress has to push through. That's the Organic Act every year. In 1916, the creation of the Park Service was part of that. And it named Stephen Mather as the first director of that new federal agency. What Congress didn't do was, as Congress does, figure out how to pay for it. It's just like, well, that's a great idea. Let's go with it. Let's put it out into the universe and see what happens, right? Good energy, good vibes, right? But they're like, yeah, no money. So Stephen Mather whips out his checkbook and starts writing a bunch of checks to personally hire the first wave of park rangers and hire clothing designers to be like, what should their uniforms be like? And hire a bunch of architects. What should the bathrooms look like? Like, this is all stuff that nobody knew how to do because nobody had ever had a national park system before, really anywhere in the world. Certainly not at this scale or with this emphasis or urgency, right? As this is happening, right, private companies are already extracting value out of tourists at all of these places and just kind of running roughshod over the area. See an arrowhead on the ground? Tip your tour guide $5 or $1 back then, and take it home, put it on your mantle. Remember, that's a trip for the rest of your life, right? So a lot of relics and a lot of environmental damage was done during this time. If you ever go to Mammoth Cave, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of signatures scratched into the walls and sooted onto the ceiling using sooty candles inside the cave of a lot of regular people and a lot of really famous people like Samuel Clemens, the author from Across the River in Missouri, right? You may have heard of him. He's got a signature scratched into the wall at Mammoth Cave because back in the 1800s, that's kind of what you did. Pay your tour guide a little bit and they'll pause the tour for a bit so you can just kind of hang out, leave your mark there, or take something with you. Snap off one of the speleothems, the stalactites or stalagmites. Take it home. And then realize it's really heavy and you're scrambling over a bunch of rocks. So drop it on the ground, break off just the tip, and take just the tip home and leave the rest there. Right? That was how Mammoth Cave was run for a really long time, unfortunately. So, in 1916, we start cleaning up our act, but we're not finished until much, much later. There's a lot of stuff to kind of overcome, including the so-called spectacle era. That is, as folks are early on at our national parks, we're gonna have to provide for them lots to do. It's not just enough to go to Yosemite and like walk around and go ooh and ah. You have to like be entertained, you know? Like be that kid in the stroller at Disney with like a slushie in one hand and like a sugar pop in the other and like half in a diabetic coma, and it's like, I'm not having fun in the greatest place on earth, right? So there's this sense of spectacle. Let's kind of church up national parks here at this time as we're kind of getting our act together as the Park Service. And so it's stuff like, let's build a 25-foot wide bonfire at the top of the rim of Yosemite Valley, and then drive a bulldozer up there, and every night after you build up a big bed of coals, and don't worry guys, we never have wildfires around Yosemite. This is fine. It's fine. It's fine. And we'll just like bulldoze the whole fire off, and it'll be, it's not a waterfall because it's fire, so we'll call it a firefall. And this was done in certain specific spots. Near here, there's one or a couple of very, very tall waterfalls, like hundreds of feet tall. Some of the tallest in North America, dropping into Yosemite Valley to flow out on the Merced River. And at certain moments of the year, at certain times of day, sunrise and sunset, or sunset only, the sun is low angle and bright and orange, and it catches the water and makes it look like this. But for all the rest of the year, we gotta throw a bunch of diesel on a bunch of old like pallet wood and stuff and bulldoze it off, because America, heck yeah. Okay, so firefall was a thing. Feeding the lodge dinner table scraps of like up to 1,000 people in some of these really big hotel lodges in Yosemite Valley, at Grand Canyon and Teton and Yellowstone and places like this. They'd take entire dumpsters full of those food scraps, food waste, and just pile it out behind the lodge, and then build bleachers around the trash pile, so people in their Sunday best, because we didn't know how to do parks at that time, like it was mostly rich tourists in their Sunday best, sitting on the bleachers, watching bears, up to 100 bears at a time, in these archival photos, just eating trash and getting territorial and very occasionally like biting someone's face off. Like this was, it seemed like a good idea at the time, I guess. I don't know. This is like our great-great-grandparents' era. Okay? So, the era of spectacle is kind of embarrassing, but relatable, right? Like, have you guys ever seen, I hate myself for the words I'm about to say, a viral Instagram or TikTok video of somebody doing something on a cliff edge, like doing a yoga handstand or something, like crow pose, you know? For my personal brand, my Lifeway, I'm an influencer, I'm creating content, I'm adding value to society. No, you're not. No, it's party stuff. All right. That's what's going on with this spectacle era. Let's see if we can drive a car out onto Inspiration Point or Glacier Point overlooking Yosemite Valley. Why not? Nobody's ever done it before. This is gonna look sick on our social media. That is a newspaper. So, we have to kind of get through these growing pains before we get to kind of an era where folks and the agency starts to respect the resources instead of trying to dress them up. So we have people like some of our former presidents serving as park rangers and elevating the sense of what it means to be a park ranger or a forester out in places like this. Like this takes it from like, man, those grubby guys way off in the woods to, wow, our president did this. Like let's go see where he worked, you know, stuff like that. It's a pretty big deal. Herbert Hoover was not a president, or he was, but anyway. We also have some folks like John D. Rockefeller. That's right, the actual Rockefeller for whom the song Rockefeller Skank was titled back in the day. This guy was richer than God. and he took a bunch of that money, and instead of plowing it into a system of essentially public libraries like Andrew Carnegie, another robber baron, he basically started a bunch of shell companies and quietly bought up land that would later become national parks or be added to national parks or be used to connect national parks together as habitat. So where we have Yellowstone National Park, which is just a big square on the map, established in 1872 because Lewis and Clark said, Congress, this place is worthless, let's make a park out of it. We'll send tourists there and they'll leave their money. And then we've got Grand Teton National Park to the south of it, and a whole bunch of bison migration territory and needs because Yellowstone Plateau is high and all those bison were freezing to death. So John D. Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., carried forward this program of land purchasing on the down low because all of the rest of this area around Yellowstone is today a whole bunch of really, really, really lucrative ranching land. This is kind of why there's a Yellowstone show. Okay, it's got that sort of vibe or aesthetic. This is super fancy land. Okay, so pick it up on Thursday with John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his daddy, and setting up the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Memorial Parkway to connect up the habitats of Teton and Yellowstone.